Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. I'm Sarah, 34. When I reached the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota, the shadows seemed to greet me by name. I'd been planning this trip for months, ever since the divorce papers were finalized, and I realized I needed to remember who I was before I became half of something that never really worked. The RV was a rental, a modest 22-footer that smelled faintly of pine-scented cleaner and other people's vacations. I'd picked up supplies in Ely, that last little town before civilization thinned out into something ancient and indifferent, and drove north along the Echo Trail until I found a dispersed camping spot near a trailhead that led down to one of the smaller lakes. It was early October, past the peak season, and I'd seen maybe 3 other vehicles on the final stretch of road. The aspens were already bare, their white bark standing out like bones against the darker pines, and the air had that knife-edge quality that promised frost by morning. I liked it that way, like the idea of being alone with my thoughts, with nothing but loon calls and the whisper of wind through evergreen needles. I parked the RV in a small clearing, the kind of spot that looked like it had been used before, but not recently. There were old fire rings, blackened stones arranged in a circle, and a couple of weathered logs positioned as makeshift benches. The trees pressed close on all sides, creating a sense of enclosure that should have felt cozy, but instead felt watchful. I told myself I was being dramatic, that city living had made me suspicious of natural quiet. The first thing I did was level the RV and hook up my portable generator. I wasn't exactly roughing it. I had electricity, a small refrigerator, a propane stove, and a surprisingly comfortable bed in the back. But I'd left my phone in Ely, deliberately, in a locker at the outfitter's shop. No signal out here anyway, and I wanted to be unreachable. Wanted to sit with the uncomfortable feelings instead of scrolling them away. As I was organizing my things, humming something tuneless to fill the silence, I noticed the lantern. It was sitting on the small folding table outside, one of those old-fashioned Coleman lanterns with a glass globe and a metal base. I stopped, my hands full of canned goods, and stared at it. I hadn't put it there. I was certain I hadn't put it there. I'd brought my own lighting, LED camp lanterns that ran on batteries, and they were still packed in the storage compartment under the RV. I set down the cans and walked over to the table. The lantern was dusty but intact, and when I peered inside the glass, I could see the mantle was still good, the fabric mesh that would glow white-hot when lit. There was fuel in the base, too. I could hear it sloshing when I picked the lantern up. Someone must have left it, I reasoned. The previous camper, maybe, though that seemed careless, leaving behind something that still worked. I carried it inside the RV, intending to store it under the sink, but something stopped me, a feeling, vague and uneasy, like I was being rude, which was insane. It was a lantern, an inanimate object. But I set it back on the table outside instead, positioning it carefully in the center, and went back to unpacking. By the time I finished setting up camp, the sun was starting its early descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. I decided to walk down to the lake before dark, following a narrow trail that wound through dense underbrush and overexposed roots. The smell of decomposing leaves was thick, that sweet rot scent of autumn, and somewhere in the distance I heard the rattling call of a raven. The lake, when I reached it, was perfectly still, a dark mirror reflecting the dying light. No boats, no fishermen, no sound except the gentle lap of water against the rocky shore. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, trying to remember the last time I'd felt this alone. Really alone, not just lonely in a crowd. When I turned to head back, the light had changed, gone gray and uncertain, and the trail looked different somehow, narrower, more overgrown. I told myself I was just disoriented, that all these trees looked the same, but my heart kicked up its pace anyway. I walked faster, keeping my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over roots, and felt a wash of relief when I saw the RV's white roof through the trees. The relief died when I got closer. The lantern was lit. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my breath catching in my throat. The lantern sat on the table exactly where I'd left it, but now it was glowing, casting a warm yellow circle of light against the gathering dusk. The flame was steady, not flickering, as if there was no wind at all. I stood there for what felt like a long time, trying to make sense of it. Had I lit it? No. I hadn't touched the matches, hadn't even thought about lighting it. Could someone else be here? Another camper trying to be helpful in some weird way? "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the quiet whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant clicking of some insect I couldn't identify. I walked slowly toward the RV, scanning the tree line for movement, for any sign of another person. The clearing was empty except for my vehicle and the glowing lantern. When I reached the table, I put my hand near the glass globe. It was hot, really hot, like it had been burning for a while. I should have been scared. Part of me was. But another part, the part that had been numb for months, felt something else. Curiosity. A sharp, bright interest that cut through the fog of depression I'd been living in. I left the lantern burning and went inside the RV to make dinner. I kept glancing out the window as I heated up a can of soup on the propane stove, watching the lantern's steady glow. It didn't flicker, didn't dim, just burned with that constant, unwavering light. After I ate, I sat at the small dinette table with a book I'd brought, some thriller I'd been meaning to read for months. But I couldn't focus on the words. My eyes kept sliding toward the window, toward the lantern. Finally, I gave up and went outside. The temperature had dropped sharply, and my breath plumed white in the air. The lantern was still burning, still steady. I walked around the clearing, checking for footprints, for any sign that someone else had been here. Nothing. The ground was soft, with fallen pine needles, and the only tracks I could see were my own. I should have extinguished the lantern right then. Should have blown it out, packed it away, driven back to Ely in the morning. But I didn't. Instead, I sat on one of the log benches and watched it burn. The woods around me had gone fully dark, that complete blackness you only get in places far from any city lights. The lantern's glow pushed back the darkness in a small circle, but beyond that circle was nothing, just absence. And in that absence I started to see shapes, not threatening exactly, just there, suggestions of forms that might have been trees, might have been something else. I sat there until the cold drove me inside, and even then I kept the curtains open so I could see the lantern. It burned all night. I know because I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop watching it, and when dawn finally started to gray the sky, the lantern was still glowing, steady as ever. In the morning light, I examined it more carefully. The fuel level hadn't changed. That was impossible. The lantern should have been empty, burned through all its fuel in the hours it had been lit. But when I unscrewed the cap and looked inside, the reservoir was still half full, exactly as it had been when I'd first picked it up. I poured myself coffee from the percolator I'd set on the propane stove and sat outside in the chilly morning air, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was wrong about the fuel level. Maybe I'd misjudged how much had been in there to begin with. Maybe the lantern was just really efficient, designed to burn for a long time on a small amount of fuel. But even as I thought these things, I didn't believe them. I spent the day hiking, taking one of the longer trails that looped through the forest and along the ridgeline above the lake. The exercise felt good, cleared some of the cobwebs from my mind, and by the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the strangeness of the lantern. Almost. It was lit again. I'd extinguished it before I left, screwed the fuel valve closed, and made sure the flame was out. I was certain of it. But now, in the fading afternoon light, it sat on the table glowing with that same steady, unwavering flame. This time, the fear came sharp and immediate. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't a mistake. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and I was alone in the woods with no phone and no way to call for help. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the RV and walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for anything that might explain this. Footprints, tire tracks, any sign of another person. I found nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed except where I'd walked earlier. I even checked under the RV, half expecting to find someone crouched there playing an elaborate prank, but there was nothing but dirt and pine needles and the rusting undercarriage. When I came back to the table, I noticed something else. There were marks on the surface, scratches in the wood that I hadn't seen before. They weren't random. They formed letters, crude and uneven, but unmistakable. Stay. My hands started to shake. The flashlight beam wavered across the letters, and I had to grip it with both hands to keep it steady. Someone had carved this. Recently, while I was gone. "Who's there?" I called out, louder this time, letting anger edge into my voice to cover the fear. "This isn't funny. Show yourself." The forest absorbed my words and gave nothing back, just that vast, indifferent silence that made me feel small and exposed. I should have left right then. Should have packed up the RV and driven back to civilization, lantern be damned. But something held me there. Partly pride. I didn't want to be the kind of person who ran from shadows and superstition. But partly something else. That same curiosity I'd felt the night before, sharper now, more insistent. I wanted to understand what was happening, needed to understand it. I went inside the RV and locked both doors, checked all the windows. I had a small can of bear spray that I'd bought in Ely, and I set it on the counter within easy reach. Then I sat at the dinette table and watched the lantern through the window as darkness fell. The hours crawled by. I tried to read, tried to focus on anything other than the glowing lantern, but it was useless. My attention kept getting pulled back to it, to the perfect steadiness of its flame. Around 9 o'clock, I saw something move in the darkness beyond the lantern's circle of light. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, but it sent my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows and the patient darkness. But I kept watching, and after a few minutes, I saw it again. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving with an odd, jerky gait along the edge of the tree line. It was too tall to be a deer, too upright to be a bear. The way it moved was wrong, like it was trying to imitate human movement but didn't quite understand how joints worked. I pressed my face against the window trying to get a better look, and the shape stopped moving. It stood there at the edge of the darkness, just beyond where the lantern light reached, and I had the distinct impression it was looking back at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the shape raised what might have been an arm and pointed toward the lantern. I jerked back from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. When I looked again, the shape was gone. Just empty darkness and the patient, watchful trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table with the bear spray in my lap and the flashlight beside me, watching the lantern burn. Every small sound made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. The RV suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a trap. A metal box with thin walls and windows I couldn't properly secure. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the RV in a clockwise direction. The sound was clear despite the RV's walls, the crunch of pine needles, the snap of small twigs. I sat frozen, not even breathing, tracking the sound as it moved around the vehicle. When it reached the door, it stopped. I waited, every muscle tensed, for the sound of the handle turning. But it never came. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, completing their circuit and fading back into the forest. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and wired at the same time, my nerves singing with fatigue and fear. The lantern was still burning. I looked at the fuel level again, unscrewed the cap with shaking hands, and found it exactly where it had been before. Half full. Impossible. I knew I needed to leave. Knew that staying here was stupid, dangerous even. But I also knew that if I left now, I would never understand what was happening. And somehow, that felt worse than staying. Because whatever this was, it had followed me here. Or maybe I'd been brought here. Either way, running didn't feel like it would solve anything. I made coffee and forced myself to eat a granola bar, though my stomach was tight with anxiety. Then I went outside to examine the ground around the RV. In the soft earth near the back bumper, I found them. Footprints. They were almost human. That was the worst part. They had the basic shape of a human footprint, the heel and the arch and the toes. But they were wrong. Too long, too narrow, with toe imprints that were more like claws, and they were deep, pressed into the earth as if whatever made them was much heavier than it should have been. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They circled the RV exactly as I'd heard, a complete loop before heading off into the trees toward the lake. I stood there staring at them, my mind trying and failing to come up with a rational explanation. A person in costume? Someone wearing modified boots? But who would do that, and why? The word, carved into the table, came back to me. Stay. I spent the day in a kind of numb fog, going through the motions of camp life while my mind spun in useless circles. I reorganized my supplies. I wiped down the RV's interior. I even tried to read again, but the words slid off my eyes without meaning. All the while, I was aware of the lantern sitting on the table, unlit now in the daylight, waiting. As afternoon bled into evening, I made a decision. If something wanted me to stay, if something was trying to communicate with me, then maybe I needed to meet it halfway. Maybe I needed to stop being afraid and start paying attention. When dusk started to thicken the air, I lit the lantern myself. My hands were steady as I opened the fuel valve and struck the match, as I touched the flame to the mantle and watched it catch, glowing white-hot. The familiar hiss of the burning fuel was almost comforting. I set the lantern back on the table and sat on the log bench, waiting. The darkness came quickly, swallowing the forest in increments. The lantern's glow pushed back against it, creating that same circle of light, that same boundary between the known and the unknown. And I sat there in the cold, watching the edges of that circle, waiting for something to appear. It didn't take long. The shape emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing, moving with that same jerky, wrong gait I'd seen the night before. In the lantern light I could see it more clearly, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It was shaped like a person, roughly, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its head was smooth and featureless, no face that I could see, just a blank expanse like unfinished clay. And as it moved closer to the lantern, I could see that it wasn't solid. It was more like a shadow that had learned to stand upright, a darkness that had taken on 3 dimensions. It stopped at the edge of the lantern's circle of light and stood there, motionless. I could feel it watching me, though it had no eyes. Could feel the weight of its attention like a physical thing. "What do you want?" My voice came out stronger than I expected, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The shape didn't answer, didn't move, just stood there at the boundary between light and dark. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. The lantern. "You want me to keep it lit, don't you? That's what this is about." Still no response, but the shape tilted its head, a small, almost curious gesture that made it seem more real somehow, more present. "I'll keep it lit," I said, not sure why I was making this promise, what bargain I was entering into. "But you have to leave me alone. No more footsteps around the RV. No more." I gestured helplessly at the thing standing in the darkness. "Whatever this is. Okay?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the shape raised one long, wrong arm and pointed past me toward the RV. I turned to look and saw more of them. 3, 4, maybe 5 shapes standing at the other edge of the clearing, all watching, all silent. My stomach dropped. I turned back to the first shape, fighting down panic. "What do you want from me?" It lowered its arm and took a step forward into the lantern light. And as it crossed that threshold, it changed. The featureless head resolved into something more defined, and I could see a face starting to form in the shadows. A human face. Not one I recognized, but unmistakably human, with eyes that were sad and ancient and tired. "Keep the light burning," it said, and its voice was like wind through dead leaves, like the rustle of paper in an empty room. "Don't let it go out." "Why?" I whispered. The other shapes had moved closer now, forming a loose circle around the clearing, all of them standing just at the edge of the lantern's glow, and I realized with a cold, creeping certainty that they were afraid. These things, whatever they were afraid of the darkness beyond the light. "There are worse things," the first shape said. "Older things. The light keeps them away, keeps us all away." "From what?" It looked past me, toward the RV, and I turned to follow its gaze. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just my vehicle sitting there in the clearing, windows dark, door closed. Then I noticed the quality of the darkness around it. It was thicker there, denser, like smoke pooling on the ground. And it was moving. The darkness was creeping toward the lantern, slow and patient and inevitable. As I watched, it began to rise, forming shapes of its own. Not the almost human figures standing around the clearing, but something else. Something that hurt to look at, that made my eyes water and my head ache. Shapes that suggested teeth and hunger and an emptiness that went on forever. "Oh, God," I breathed. "The lantern keeps them back," the first shape said, "but only while it burns. If it goes out—" It didn't finish the sentence. It didn't need to. I looked at the lantern, at its steady flame, and understood. This was a boundary, a threshold, and I was standing on it, had been standing on it since I arrived. The lantern wasn't just creating light, it was creating a barrier, a space of safety in a forest that was filled with things that should not exist. "How long?" I asked. "How long do I have to keep it burning?" The shape shook its head slowly. "Until you leave. Or until you don't." The darkness around the RV was growing thicker, pushing closer to the circle of light. I could hear it now, a low rustling sound like thousands of insects moving in unison, and underneath that, something else. A voice, maybe, or many voices, whispering words in a language I didn't understand and didn't want to. The almost human shapes around the clearing began to back away, retreating into the forest. All except the first one, which stood there looking at me with its sad, ancient eyes. "I'm sorry," it said. "We thought you knew, thought you understood what the light meant." "What are you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "What's left," it said. "What remains after the darkness takes everything else." Then it, too, backed away, melting into the trees, and I was alone with the lantern and the darkness that pressed against its light. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the shadows writhe and coil at the edge of the lantern's glow. Time felt strange, elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made my head spin. At some point I realized I was cold, shaking with it, and I forced myself to move, to check the lantern's fuel level, to make sure the flame was still steady, half full, still half full, as if the fuel was renewing itself, or as if the lantern existed in some pocket of space where normal physical laws didn't apply. I thought about running, about jumping in the RV and driving away as fast as I could, but I knew, somehow, that it wouldn't work. The darkness would follow. The boundary I'd crossed wasn't geographical. It was something else, something deeper. So I stayed. I fed more fuel to the lantern, though it didn't seem to need it. I sat on the log bench wrapped in a sleeping bag I'd retrieved from the RV, and I watched the light hold back the darkness. As the night wore on, I started to see things in the shadows. Not the shapes from before, but other things. Memories, maybe, or possibilities. I saw my ex-husband's face, twisted with an anger I'd never seen in life. I saw my mother, dead 3 years now, standing at the edge of the light with her hands outstretched. I saw myself, or a version of myself, standing in the darkness with empty eyes and a smile that was too wide. Not real, I whispered to myself. Not real. But they felt real. They felt more real than anything I'd experienced in months, more vivid than the nummy, gray days that had followed the divorce. The darkness wasn't just showing me things, it was offering them. Offering to take away the pain, the loneliness, the exhausting weight of being myself. All I had to do was let the light go out. I understood then why the lantern kept lighting itself. It wasn't trying to trap me. It was trying to save me. Because I'd come here to be alone, to sit with my uncomfortable feelings, and I'd chosen a place where loneliness had weight and substance, where it could take form and reach out with hungry hands. The shapes in the darkness grew more insistent as the night deepened. They pressed against the circle of light, testing it, and I could feel the lantern straining to hold them back. The flame flickered for the first time, just a small tremor, and the darkness surged forward like a wave before the light steadied and pushed it back. I realized I was crying, tears hot on my cold cheeks. Not from fear exactly, though I was afraid, but from something else. Recognition, maybe, because I knew what the darkness was offering, and I knew how tempting it was, how easy it would be to just let go, to stop fighting, to let the emptiness in. But I didn't. I stayed on the bench, wrapped in my sleeping bag, and I watched the light hold. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if it was fighting its way through something thick and resistant. The darkness began to thin, to lose its substance, and the shapes within it faded to suggestions and then to nothing. By the time the sun cleared the treetops, the clearing looked normal again, just trees and fallen leaves and morning light slanting through the branches. The lantern was still burning, its flame steady and bright even in the daylight. I was exhausted, more tired than I'd ever been in my life, but I was also, strangely, at peace, because I'd sat with the darkness, had looked directly at the emptiness I'd been trying to escape, and I'd chosen not to give in to it, had chosen to keep the light burning. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever this place was, whatever boundary I'd crossed, it wasn't meant for long-term habitation. The lantern could hold back the darkness, but I could feel it wearing on me, feel it pulling at something essential deep inside. If I stayed much longer, I might become like those shapes at the edge of the clearing. Not quite human anymore, just something left behind. I packed up the RV slowly, methodically, keeping the lantern burning the whole time. When everything else was loaded and secured, I picked up the lantern and set it carefully on the passenger seat, making sure it wouldn't tip over while I drove. The drive back to Ely was strange. The lantern kept burning on the seat beside me, its light visible even in the bright morning sun, and I could feel the darkness following. Not threatening, exactly. More like watching, waiting to see what I would do. I made it to town around noon, drove straight to the outfitter's shop where I'd left my phone. The owner looked at me strangely when I came in, his eyes moving from my face to the lantern I was carrying. "You look like you've been through hell," he said. Something like that. I set the lantern on his counter and he took an involuntary step back. "Where'd you get that?" "It was at my campsite. Someone left it there." He stared at the lantern for a long moment, and I could see something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or fear. "You were out past Echo Trail, weren't you? Near the Boundary Waters?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he already knew. "You should probably keep that lantern burning for a few more days, until you're sure nothing followed you back." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "You know what's out there." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Some things. Not everything. We get people sometimes, coming back from that area with stories. Most of them leave and never come back. Some of them—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. "Some of them aren't as lucky as you." I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand what had happened to me out there, but I was so tired I could barely stand. I picked up the lantern again, feeling its weight, feeling the steady pull of the flame. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He just nodded. "Drive safe, and keep that lantern lit." I did. I drove all the way back to Minneapolis with the lantern burning on the seat beside me, its flame steady and unwavering despite the wind from the open window. I kept it lit in my apartment, sitting on the small table in my living room, and I watched it burn for 3 days straight. On the 4th day, when I woke up and looked at the lantern, I found it was finally out. The fuel reservoir was empty, truly empty this time, and the mantle had gone cold. I unscrewed the cap and looked inside, and there, at the bottom of the reservoir, I found something I hadn't seen before, a small piece of paper folded tight. I fished it out with shaking fingers and unfolded it. The paper was old, brittle, and the writing on it was faded but still legible. It was a list of names, maybe 20 or 30 of them, each one followed by a date. I recognized some of the names. They were people who'd gone missing in the Boundary Waters over the years. Cases that had never been solved. Bodies that had never been found. At the bottom of the list, in fresher ink, was a new name. My name, Sarah Morrison. But there was no date next to it. Just a question mark. I burned the paper in my kitchen sink, watching the flames consume the names, the dates, the question mark that might have been my fate if I'd let the light go out. Then I threw the lantern away, wrapped it in a garbage bag, and took it to the dumpster behind my building. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can still smell the kerosene, still see the steady glow of that impossible flame, and I wonder about the shapes I saw at the edge of the clearing, about what they might have been before the darkness took them, before they became just shadows of what they'd once been, trapped in the space between the light and the dark. I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next person who comes looking for solitude in the wrong place, waiting for the next person who might not be strong enough to keep the light burning. I know I'll never go back, but I also know that part of me is still there, will always be there, sitting on that log bench in the cold October night, watching the lantern burn against the darkness. Because some things you can't outrun. Some things you carry with you forever. The divorce was finalized. I signed the papers and moved on with my life. I got a new job, made new friends, tried to rebuild something resembling normalcy. But I never forgot what I learned in those woods. That loneliness has weight. That emptiness can take form. That sometimes the only thing standing between you and the dark is a light you choose to keep burning. I keep lights on in my apartment now, more than I probably need, and I never, ever let them all go out at once, because I remember the feeling of that darkness pressing in, remember the hunger in it, the patient inevitability, and I remember the choice I made, to keep the flame alive even when giving in would have been so much easier. That's what I took from the Boundary Waters. Not peace, not healing, but the knowledge that I could face the darkness and choose to keep fighting. That I could sit with the emptiness and not let it consume me. It's not much, but some days it's enough. Some days, when I'm feeling particularly tired or particularly alone, I think about buying another lantern, about lighting it and keeping it burning, just in case. But I don't. Because I know that the light I'm supposed to keep burning isn't an external flame. It's something inside, something that has to be tended and fed and protected from the darkness that's always waiting. I learned that in the woods. I learned it from shapes at the edge of light and voices in the darkness and a lantern that burned without fuel. I learned it from sitting in the cold and choosing not to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only option left. The shadows still greet me by name sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, but I don't answer. I just turn on another light and keep going. That's all any of us can do, really. Keep the light burning. Keep moving forward, and hope that when the darkness finally comes for us, we're strong enough to hold it back one more time. Story 2. My name is Daniel. I'm 34. The air at Organ Mountain's Desert Peaks National Monument pressed against me like a hand. I'd driven the RV out from El Paso on a Thursday morning, looking for a long weekend away from the accounting firm and the fluorescent lights that had been giving me migraines. The monument sprawled across southern New Mexico, all jagged peaks and desert scrub, and I'd read about a dispersed camping area near the eastern edge where you could park an RV if you didn't mind the rough road. I didn't mind. I wanted rough. I wanted remote. I wanted to sit outside at night and hear absolutely nothing but wind. My dog Cooper rode shotgun the whole way, a 3-year-old Australian Shepherd mix I'd adopted after my divorce finalized. He had one blue eye and one brown, and he was the best listener I'd ever met. Better than my ex-wife, that's for sure. Better than my therapist. Cooper just sat there, watched the desert roll by, and didn't ask me why I was doing this or whether I'd thought it through. The road into the dispersed camping area was exactly as rough as advertised. The RV, a 26-foot Class C I'd bought used, groaned over rocks and dipped into ruts that made my teeth click together. But I made it. By 2 in the afternoon, I was parked in a clearing surrounded by creosote bushes and cholla cacti, with the Organ Mountains rising dark and serrated against the pale sky to the west. It was hot, dry heat, the kind that sucks moisture out of your skin before you even notice you're sweating. I set up the awning, filled Cooper's water bowl twice, and cracked open a beer. The silence was immediate and total. No highway noise, no neighbors, no planes overhead. Just wind hissing through the brush and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. Perfect. I spent the rest of that first afternoon reading in a folding chair under the awning, while Cooper dozed in the shade. The sun dropped fast once it started going down, and the temperature plummeted with it. By the time I grilled a burger on the little propane stove, I needed a jacket. The stars came out in waves, more than I'd ever seen, and I sat there with Cooper at my feet and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in months. That first night, I slept hard, the kind of sleep where you don't even dream, just fall into blackness and wake up confused about where you are. I came to around dawn with Cooper licking my face, whining softly. He needed to go out. I stumbled to the door in my boxer shorts and t-shirt, let him out, and watched him trot off into the brush to do his business. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky was turning that pale gray blue that comes right before dawn. And that's when I first felt it, that pressure, like the air itself was leaning against me, pushing at my chest and shoulders, a physical weight that made me want to step backward into the RV. I looked around, blinking sleep out of my eyes, trying to figure out what was wrong. Nothing looked different. The desert stretched out in every direction, empty and still. Cooper was sniffing around a clump of cholla about 20 yards out, but the air, Jesus! It felt thick, like I was underwater, like I had to push through it to move. I took a deep breath and it didn't help. My lungs filled, but I still felt like I wasn't getting enough oxygen. Cooper came trotting back, and I opened the door for him. He bounded inside, and I followed, closing and locking the door behind me. The pressure eased immediately. Inside the RV, the air felt normal. I stood there in the little kitchen area, heart beating too fast, and told myself I was being stupid. Altitude, maybe, or dehydration. I drank a glass of water and went back to bed. When I got up again a few hours later, the sun was fully up and everything seemed fine. I made coffee, scrambled some eggs, and took Cooper for a walk around the area. The pressure was gone. The air felt normal. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, some weird, half-asleep hypnagogic thing. But that night, it happened again. I was sitting outside after dinner, watching the stars and listening to a podcast on my phone, when the pressure came back. Gradual this time, not sudden, like someone was slowly piling invisible weight onto my shoulders. I stood up, thinking maybe it was my posture, but standing didn't help. The air pressed against me from all sides. Cooper, who'd been lying at my feet, got up and moved closer to the RV door, whining. I followed him inside. Again, immediate relief. I stood at the door, looking out through the screen, and tried to make sense of it. Some kind of atmospheric thing? Barometric pressure? But I'd never heard of anything like this, and I'd spent plenty of time camping before. I pulled out my phone to Google it, but of course there was no signal out here. I'd known that before I came. That was part of the appeal. The third day, Friday, I woke up to find footprints around the RV. Not animal prints. Human. Bare feet, adult-sized, circling the RV in a path that had been walked multiple times, deep enough to leave clear impressions in the sandy soil. I stood there in the morning sun, coffee mug in hand, staring at those prints and feeling my stomach drop. Cooper sniffed at them, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. I walked the perimeter slowly, following the track. It was a perfect circle, maybe 10 feet from the RV all the way around, and it looked like whoever made it had walked it over and over, the same path each time, deepening the prints. There were no other prints leading to or from the circle, just this closed loop. I looked out at the desert. Empty. Silent. The nearest other camper, according to the ranger I'd talked to when I got my permit, was at least 5 miles away on a different road. My hands were shaking. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the dinette trying to think. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked circles around my RV in the middle of the night, barefoot, and I hadn't heard a thing. Cooper hadn't barked. I'm a light sleeper. The divorce gave me insomnia that still hadn't fully gone away. How had I not heard? Unless I had heard, and I thought it was the wind. I remembered waking once in the night, briefly, to a soft, shuffling sound. But I'd been half asleep, and I'd assumed it was Cooper moving around, or the RV settling, or just desert sounds. I'd gone right back to sleep. I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself it was someone playing a prank. Maybe another camper, someone who'd seen me arrive and decided to mess with me. It was a shitty thing to do, but people were shitty sometimes. That was easier to believe than the alternative, which was that something else had made those prints. But the prints were bare feet, in the desert, at night, when it got down into the 40s. That afternoon, I considered leaving, just packing up and driving back to El Paso. But I'd taken the whole week off work, and the idea of going back to my apartment after just 3 days felt like admitting defeat. Defeat to what? To being scared? I was 34 years old. I wasn't going to let some footprints run me off. Besides, the pressure had only happened at night. During the day, everything was fine. The air was normal. The desert was beautiful. Cooper and I went for a long hike that afternoon, following a trail that wound up into the foothills. We saw lizards and jackrabbits and the bleached skull of something that might have been a coyote. No people. No signs of anyone. By the time we got back to the RV, I'd almost talked myself into staying. That night, I made sure the doors were locked. I closed all the window shades, I kept Cooper inside, and I sat in the driver's seat with the engine running for a while, heater on, trying to decide what to do. The pressure came back around 9 o'clock. This time, it was worse. Not just weight on my shoulders, but a feeling like the air was hardening, becoming solid, squeezing me from all sides. I couldn't get a full breath. My chest felt constricted, ribs aching. I turned on all the lights inside the RV, and Cooper pressed himself against my legs, trembling. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Outside, walking slowly around the RV. The same shuffling sound I'd heard the night before, but now I was awake. Now I was listening, and there was no mistaking it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the sand. Circling. The same path as the prints. I moved to the window. Pulled the shade back just enough to peek out. There was enough starlight to see by once my eyes adjusted, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. A figure, walking, naked, pale in the starlight, thin to the point of emaciation. It moved with a strange, jerky gait, like its joints didn't quite work right. And even from inside the RV, even through the window, I could feel it. The pressure was coming from it, radiating out from that figure like heat from a fire, except it was the opposite of heat. It was weight, it was gravity, it was the air itself made heavy and hostile. The figure completed its circle and started another. It didn't look at the RV, didn't acknowledge my presence at all, just walked, bare feet pressing into the sand, arms hanging limp at its sides. Cooper was barking now, frantic, and I grabbed him, held him, told him to be quiet even though my own voice was shaking. The figure kept walking. Another circle. And another. I don't know how long I stood there watching. Could have been 10 minutes. Could have been an hour. Time felt wrong, stretched and compressed all at once. Eventually the figure stopped, just stopped mid-step, 1 foot in the air, and stood there frozen. Then it turned its head toward the RV. I dropped the shade and stepped back, heart slamming against my ribs. Cooper was still barking. I pulled him into the bedroom at the back of the RV, closed the accordion door, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall and my dog in my lap. The footsteps resumed, but different now. Not circling, coming closer, directly toward the RV. I heard them approach the door. Stop. Then I heard breathing, right outside, wet, ragged breathing, like lungs full of fluid, and under that, a sound like clicking, like someone, something, was testing the door handle. I had my phone in my hand, flashlight app ready, though I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. Cooper had stopped barking and was just whimpering, pressed against my chest. The clicking stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, then faded. Silence. I waited, counted to 100, then 200. The pressure in the air was still there, but it felt farther away now, like whatever had been at the door had moved off. I didn't sleep that night, just sat there on the bed, fully clothed, boots on, with Cooper in my arms and my keys in my pocket. Every few minutes I'd convince myself I should just go, just start the engine and drive out of here in the dark. But every time I thought about opening that door and stepping outside, my body refused to move. Dawn came eventually. The pressure lifted. I waited another hour until the sun was well up before I finally opened the bedroom door and crept to the front of the RV. The footprints were still there. The same circle. But now there was something else. Handprints on the door, pressed against the white fiberglass, but not normal handprints. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and there were only 4 fingers on each hand. The prints were smudged with something dark that could have been dirt or could have been something else. I grabbed my stuff, just threw everything in bags, didn't bother with organizing or packing properly. Cooper jumped in the passenger seat and I started the engine, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The RV lurched forward and I steered it toward the rough road that led back to the main highway. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Didn't want to see if anything was following. The road seemed longer than I remembered. Rougher. Twice I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, that I was going the wrong direction. But the GPS on my phone was dead, and I didn't have any other choice but to keep going. The sun was bright. The desert looked the same as it had when I'd driven in 4 days ago. But everything felt wrong. The air, even inside the RV, felt too thick. My ears kept popping like I was changing altitude rapidly, even though the road was relatively flat. And then I saw them, standing in the road ahead. 3 figures, naked, pale, impossibly thin, standing in a line across the road, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes. The RV skidded, fishtailed, and I fought with the steering wheel to keep it from tipping. When I finally got it under control, I was maybe 50 yards from the figures. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I could see now that they were similar to the one from last night but different. These ones had their mouths hanging open, jaws dislocated like snakes, and even from this distance I could see their skin was wrong, textured like tree bark, cracked and oozing something dark. Cooper was barking again, throwing himself against the passenger window. I looked to my left, then my right. Open desert on both sides, scattered with rocks and cacti. No way to drive around them without risking the undercarriage of the RV, maybe getting stuck. But I couldn't go back. Behind me was that campsite, and the thing that had circled it all night. The figure in the middle of the road took a step forward, then another. The other 2 followed. I made a decision, slammed my foot on the gas and aimed straight for them. The RV surged forward, engine roaring. The figures didn't move, didn't react, and for a horrible second I thought they were going to let me hit them, that I was about to find out what happens when you run over something that isn't entirely real. But at the last second they stepped aside, just melted to the sides of the road, and I blew past them doing 40 miles an hour on a road that was barely more than a dirt track. I didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept driving until the rough road met the paved highway, and then I kept driving until I saw other cars, other people, until the world felt normal again. I stopped at a gas station in Las Cruces, filled the tank, bought a bottle of water and a bag of food for Cooper. My hands had finally stopped shaking. While the tank filled, I walked around the RV, looking at the handprints on the door. They were still there, 4-fingered, too long, pressed into the fiberglass with enough force that they'd left permanent dents. The smudges around them were definitely dirt, I told myself. Just dirt. I used the squeegee from the gas pump to scrub at them until most of the marks were gone, but the dents remained. I can still see them if I look close enough. That was 4 months ago. I haven't been camping since. Haven't taken the RV out at all, actually. It's parked in a storage lot near my apartment, and I pay the monthly fee, but I can't bring myself to sell it. Maybe someday I'll work up the nerve to go somewhere else, somewhere far from New Mexico, somewhere with trees and rain and people nearby. But probably not. Cooper's different now, too. He won't sleep through the night anymore. Wakes up around 3 or 4 in the morning, every morning, and paces around the apartment whining. Sometimes he stands at the window and stares out at the parking lot like he's watching something I can't see. I asked my therapist if trauma can transfer to dogs. She said yes, in a way. They pick up on our fear, our anxiety, and it becomes their fear too. I didn't tell her what we saw in the desert. Didn't tell anyone. Who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night when Cooper's pacing and I can't sleep, I feel it again. That pressure. Like the air in my apartment is pressing against me, testing me, seeing if I'm still afraid. And I am. I'm so afraid. Because I keep thinking about those footprints, the perfect circle around the RV, and I keep wondering, what if it wasn't trying to scare me away? What if it was just marking me, claiming me? What if it followed me home? Last week, I woke up at 3 in the morning and found Cooper standing at the front door, growling. I got up, turned on every light, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but there were footprints on the carpet, bare feet, leading from the elevator to my door, and then leading back again. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my living room with all the lights on and a kitchen knife in my lap, waiting for the pressure to come back. It didn't, but it will. I know it will, because every night now, around 3 or 4 in the morning, I hear it. Outside my window, in the hallway, sometimes on the roof, footsteps, slow and shuffling, walking in circles, waiting. Story 3. The Bowing Tree. I'm Emily, 29 years old. The first tree at Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota bowed toward me, as if listening. I didn't think much of it at the time. Trees do strange things in the wind, and there was plenty of wind that October afternoon when Jake and I pulled our RV into the primitive campsite off the Gunflint Trail. The massive white pine leaned at an angle that seemed deliberate, its crown tilting in our direction even though the breeze was blowing the opposite way. Jake laughed when I pointed it out. "It's welcoming us," he said, kissing my temple as he hopped down from the driver's seat. "See? Even nature knows we needed this. We did need it." After 18 months of Jake's cancer treatments, the surgeries, the radiation, the endless appointments that consumed our lives, we were finally free. His last scan had come back clear. The doctors used the word remission, like it was a gift, and maybe it was, but it came wrapped in exhaustion and trauma that neither of us knew how to unwrap. This trip was supposed to be our reset. 2 weeks in the wilderness with nothing but each other and the quiet. The Boundary Waters stretched out before us like a promise. 1,000,000 acres of forest and lakes, so remote that motorboats weren't even allowed on most of the water. Our campsite sat on the edge of a small, unnamed lake, surrounded by towering pines and birch trees that had already dropped most of their leaves. The ground was carpeted in gold and crimson, and the air smelled like wet earth and wood smoke from distant campfires. "This is perfect," I said, breathing it in. "Absolutely perfect." Jake smiled, but I could see the tightness around his eyes. He was tired. The drive from Minneapolis had taken 6 hours, and he'd insisted on doing most of it despite my protests. He'd lost so much weight during treatment that his clothes hung loose on his frame, and there were moments when I caught him moving carefully, like his body was something fragile he had to negotiate with. "Let me set up," I said. "You rest." "Emily, I mean it. Sit." He didn't argue, which told me how exhausted he really was. While he settled into one of our camping chairs with a book, I got to work leveling the RV and connecting our water and electricity to the primitive hookups. The campsite was basic, just a cleared area with a fire ring and a picnic table, but it had what we needed. Privacy, mostly. Our nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away through dense forest. By the time I finished, the sun was starting its descent toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jake had fallen asleep in his chair, his book open on his lap. I covered him with a blanket and started preparing dinner, keeping one eye on him while I worked. He looked peaceful, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in over a year. That's when I noticed the tree again. The white pine at the edge of our site, the one that had been leaning toward us, had moved. Not much, maybe a foot, but it was definitely closer than it had been an hour ago, and its angle had shifted. Now it seemed to be leaning over Jake, its lowest branches reaching out like fingers trying to touch his hair. I stood very still, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. Trees don't move. Not like that. Not unless they're falling, and this tree wasn't falling. It was reaching. "Jake," I said quietly. He stirred, blinking awake. Look at that tree, the big pine. Does it look different to you?" He followed my gaze, squinting. Different how? Closer. He laughed, but it was a tired sound. Trees don't move. I know that. But look at it. Really look." He studied it for a long moment, then shook his head. "It's the same tree. You're probably just tired. Come on, let's eat." I wanted to argue, but he was right about the tired part. We both were. Instead, I served the pasta I'd made, and we ate while the sun finished setting and the forest filled with shadows. The temperature dropped quickly once darkness fell, and we retreated inside the RV. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jake was out immediately, his breathing deep and even beside me, but I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Wind moving through branches, the distant call of an owl, something small rustling through the underbrush near our site, and another sound, softer, like wood creaking. I got up and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Our campsite was illuminated by a single solar lamp we'd hung near the door, casting a weak circle of yellow light. Beyond that circle, the forest was absolute blackness, but I could make out the silhouette of the white pine, and I swear it was closer. Not by much, maybe another foot or two, but definitely closer. And it wasn't just leaning anymore. It was bent, its trunk curved in a way that seemed anatomically impossible, bringing its crown down almost level with the top of our RV. I watched it for a long time, my breath fogging the window. It didn't move while I was looking, but I had the strangest sensation that it was watching me back. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The tree was exactly where it had been the day before, standing straight and normal at the edge of our campsite. Jake made coffee while I studied it from every angle, looking for evidence of the impossible bend I'd seen in the darkness. "Sleep okay?" he asked, handing me a mug. "Not really. You, like the dead." He smiled, then caught himself. Poor choice of words. It's fine. I sipped the coffee, letting its warmth chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Want to take the canoe out? Explore the lake? Absolutely. We spent the morning on the water, paddling along the shoreline and marveling at the clarity of the lake. It was so clear we could see fish swimming 20 feet down, their bodies flashing silver in the sunlight. Jake looked better after a few hours in the fresh air, color returning to his cheeks, and I felt some of my unease lifting. This was what we needed. Peace, beauty, distance from everything that had hurt us. We returned to camp around noon, hungry and ready for lunch. That's when I noticed the marks. They were carved into the picnic table, shallow grooves forming letters that definitely hadn't been there that morning. I would have seen them. I'd eaten breakfast at that table. "Leave." "Jake," I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "Look at this." He came over, frowning. "What the hell? Did you do this?" "Why would I do that?" He ran his fingers over the letters. "These are fresh. The wood inside is still light." We both turned to scan the forest around us. Nothing moved except the wind through the branches. Our campsite was still empty, still isolated. "Maybe someone came by while we were on the lake," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Kids playing a prank? Out here? We're miles from the nearest trailhead. Rangers, then. Maybe they want to close this site for some reason and they're trying to scare us off." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel right. The letters were too crude, too urgent, and there was something about the way they were carved. Each stroke looked violent, like whoever made them had been pressing hard enough to splinter the wood. "Let's just go," I said. "Pack up and find another site." We just got here, and I paid for 2 weeks." "I don't care about the money." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing whether to argue. Finally, he sighed. "Okay, if it makes you feel better, we'll move tomorrow." But let's at least stay tonight. It took forever to set everything up. I wanted to insist we leave immediately, but the rational part of my brain agreed with him. It was already early afternoon. By the time we packed up and drove to a new site, it would be nearly dark. And maybe he was right. Maybe it was just kids or rangers and we were overreacting. Fine, I said, but if anything else weird happens, we're gone. Deal. We tried to enjoy the rest of the day, but the word carved into the table seemed to pulse with malevolence every time I looked at it. Jake built a fire as the sun started to set, and we roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, doing our best to pretend everything was normal. But I kept catching him glancing at the tree line, his jaw tight. "You're freaked out, too," I said. "A little, but probably for nothing." The fire burned down to embers, and we retreated into the RV as full darkness settled over the forest. I locked the door, something I'd never done while camping, and checked it twice before getting into bed. I woke to the sound of scraping. For a moment, I couldn't place it. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something being dragged across wood. I lay perfectly still, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jake was asleep beside me, one arm thrown over his face. The scraping continued. It was coming from outside. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, my legs shaking. The solar lamp had died, leaving our campsite in complete darkness except for the faint glow of embers in the fire ring. I pressed my face close to the glass, trying to see. At first, I couldn't make anything out. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. The white pine had moved again. It was right next to the RV now, close enough that its lowest branches were touching the roof. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the tree was bending, its trunk curving impossibly low, and one of its branches was dragging back and forth across the side of the RV. That was the scraping sound. I watched in frozen horror as the branch moved with purpose, carving something into the metal exterior. When it finally stopped and pulled away, I could just make out letters in the faint red glow from the fire pit. Leave. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. Trees don't move. Trees don't write messages. This wasn't possible, but I was watching it happen. The branch reached out again, this time tapping against the window I was standing at. Tap, tap, tap. Deliberate, patient, like it knew I was watching. "Jake," I whispered, then louder. "Jake!" He jerked awake. "What? What's wrong?" "The tree. Look at the tree." He scrambled out of bed and joined me at the window. By the time he got there, the branch had pulled back. The white pine stood motionless in the darkness, looking for all the world like a normal tree. I don't see anything." It was moving. It was writing on the RV. Writing? The word leave, same as the table. He stared out the window for a long moment, then turned to look at me. In the dim light, I could see concern in his eyes, but not the kind of concern I wanted. He was worried about me, not about what I'd seen. "You had a nightmare," he said gently. "I'm awake. I've been awake. Jake, I know what I saw. Emily, you haven't been sleeping well since we got here. You're exhausted, and sometimes when we're exhausted, our minds—" "Don't." I stepped away from him. "Don't do that. Don't make me feel crazy. I'm not trying to make you feel crazy. I'm just saying that trees don't move and they definitely don't write messages. So maybe you were dreaming, or maybe you saw shadows, or maybe something is very wrong here and we need to leave. Now. Tonight." He ran a hand through his hair, and I could see the exhaustion in every line of his face. He'd been through so much. We both had. And now, here I was, asking him to pack up in the middle of the night because I was convinced a tree was trying to communicate with us. "In the morning," he said finally. "First light, we'll pack up and go. But I can't drive in the dark on these roads, Em. It's not safe. Just a few more hours." I wanted to argue, but he was right about the roads. The Gunflint Trail was treacherous even in daylight, all switchbacks and steep grades. In the dark, with deer and moose crossing randomly, it would be suicidal. "Fine," I said, "but I'm staying awake, and we're keeping all the lights on." He didn't argue. We turned on every lamp in the RV and sat together on the small couch, watching the windows. Jake tried to read, but I could tell he wasn't absorbing anything. His eyes kept straying to the darkness outside. The hours crept by. Nothing moved in the forest. The white pine stood exactly where it had been, not even swaying in the wind. If I hadn't seen it move myself, I would have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Around 4 in the morning, Jake's head started to nod. "Em, I'm sorry. I have to sleep. Just for an hour." "It's okay. Go ahead." He squeezed my hand and moved back to the bed. Within minutes, his breathing deepened. I stayed on the couch, staring out the windows, my body humming with an exhaustion so profound it felt like gravity was pressing me down into the cushions. Maybe I did fall asleep. I'm still not sure, because what happened next has the quality of a dream. Even though I know I was awake, the forest began to move, not just the white pine. All the trees. They bent toward our RV like flowers turning toward the sun, their branches reaching out, their trunks curving in ways that should have broken them. The sound of wood groaning filled the air, so loud I couldn't believe Jake didn't wake up. It sounded like 1,000 doors being forced open, like the forest itself was screaming. And then I heard the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate inside my own skull. "Leave our dead alone." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The trees pressed closer, their branches now touching the RV on all sides, covering the windows until we were enclosed in a cage of wood. The walls creaked under the pressure. "You disturbed them," the voice continued. "You woke them. Now they're hungry." I didn't disturb anything, I tried to say, but my voice wouldn't work. 38 graves, 38 children, buried in the roots, fed to the trees. They sleep until they're woken. Images flashed through my mind. Not my memories, but something else's memories, forced into my consciousness like a download. Children in old-fashioned clothes running through these woods, men in dark coats chasing them, a school that wasn't a school, a place where children went and never came home, bodies buried in the forest, hidden in shallow graves that the trees grew over, their roots threading through small ribs and skulls. "The sick one woke them," the voice said. "His sickness sings to them. They want him." The branches began to tap against the walls, against the roof, a staccato rhythm like fingernails on glass, or like bones clicking together. Then, all at once, they stopped. The trees pulled back, returning to their normal positions. The white pine straightened, its branches lifting away from our RV. Silence fell over the forest like a blanket. I sat gasping in the sudden stillness, my whole body shaking. The first gray light of dawn was seeping through the windows. "Em?" Jake was awake, looking at me with concern. "Did you sleep at all? We have to leave." My voice came out raw. Right now. Something in my face must have convinced him not to argue. He got up and started pulling on clothes. "Okay, let's pack up." It took us 20 minutes to secure everything for travel. I kept expecting the trees to move again, to stop us, but they stayed motionless. The forest looked normal in the growing light, beautiful even, with the dawn mist rising from the lake. As Jake did a final check of the hookups, I approached the white pine. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it up close to confirm it was just a tree. Maybe I thought I could understand what had happened if I could touch it. I pressed my hand against its bark. It was warm. Trees shouldn't be warm, not on a cold October morning. And then I felt it, a pulse, like a heartbeat. I snatched my hand away and stumbled backward. That's when I looked down and saw what was at the base of the tree. There were items scattered in the needles. A child's shoe, so rotted it was barely recognizable. A rusted pair of glasses. A small metal cross on a broken chain, and bones. Small bones, half buried in the dirt, threaded through with roots. "Jake," I called, my voice strangled. "Jake, come here." He jogged over. "What?" I pointed. He looked down, and I watched the color drain from his face. Jesus Christ. "We need to call someone. The police, the rangers, someone." "We don't have service out here." "Then we drive until we do." We ran back to the RV. Jake started the engine while I buckled myself into the passenger seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the seatbelt. As we pulled out of the campsite, I looked back at the white pine one last time. It was bowing toward us, bowing like it had when we'd first arrived, like it was saying goodbye, or thank you. The drive back to civilization was a blur. Jake pushed the RV as fast as he dared on the winding roads, and neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd found evidence of something horrible, and we'd spent the night surrounded by it. It took an hour to reach an area with cell service. I called 911 and tried to explain what we'd found, where we'd found it. The dispatcher sounded skeptical but said she'd send rangers to investigate. We drove another 2 hours to Grand Marais, the nearest real town, and checked into a motel. While Jake showered, I sat on the bed and researched on my phone, typing with shaking fingers. Boundary waters missing children, Minnesota boarding school graves, residential school deaths. The results made my stomach turn. In the early 1900s, there had been a school near the Boundary Waters, a place where indigenous children were forcibly sent. The official records claimed it closed in 1927, but there were stories, rumors, testimonies from survivors that spoke of children who disappeared. Children who died from disease, from abuse, from escape attempts that ended badly in the unforgiving wilderness. Children whose deaths were never officially recorded, whose families were never notified. And there were stories about the forest. Local Ojibwe elders spoke of trees that remembered, trees that held grief in their roots, trees that would sometimes reach out to the living as if trying to tell them something. Jake emerged from the bathroom, his skin pink from the hot water. "Did you find anything?" I showed him the articles. He read them in silence, his jaw clenching tighter with each paragraph. "Those bones," he said finally. "They were real. Those children were real." "I know. The voice you heard. What did it say exactly?" I hesitated. I hadn't told him about the voice, about the images forced into my mind. It said the children were hungry, that your sickness woke them. He sat down heavily on the bed. "My cancer. The death in you. I think they could sense it. Maybe they thought you were one of them. Christ, Em." We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Jake said, "What do you think happened? Really happened, I mean. Not just the graves, but the tree, the movement. I don't know. Maybe there's a scientific explanation, some kind of root system that makes trees move at night, or gas that causes hallucinations, or—" "You don't believe that?" "No," I admitted. "I don't. So what do you believe?" I thought about the warmth of the bark, the pulse I'd felt, the way the white pine had bowed when we arrived and bowed again when we left. I think those children never left. I think they're in the trees, in the roots, in the soil. I think they've been trying to tell their story for almost 100 years, and no one was listening. Until us. Why us? Because we know what it's like to almost die. Because, Jake, you came so close, and maybe they recognize that. Maybe they thought you could understand." His hand found mine. His fingers were still warm from the shower, but mine were ice cold. "Do you think they'll find the graves? Really find them?" "I hope so." We waited 3 days in Grand Marais for news. On the 4th day, a ranger came to our motel. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a careful way of speaking. "We found the site," he said. "You were right. There are remains. Multiple sets. We've called in forensic anthropologists and contacted the tribal council. It's going to take months, maybe years, to process everything properly." "How many?" I asked. "We're not sure yet. So far, we've identified evidence of at least 23 individuals, all children." I felt Jake's hand tighten around mine. "Did you notice anything unusual while you were there?" the ranger asked. "Anything at all?" I wanted to tell him about the trees, about the voice, about everything that had happened, but I could see the skepticism already forming in his eyes. He thought we'd gotten lucky, stumbled onto the graves by accident. He didn't want to hear about white pines that moved or whispers in the dark. "Just the bones at the base of the tree," I said. "That's what made us look." He nodded, satisfied with this answer. "You did a good thing, finding them. Those children, they can finally go home now. Whatever's left of them, their families can bury them properly." After he left, Jake and I packed up and pointed the RV south. We didn't talk about going back to the Boundary Waters. We both knew we wouldn't. Maybe someday, years from now, when the graves had been excavated and the children had been laid to rest with dignity, we might return. But not now. Not yet. As we drove out of Grand Marais, passing through the last of the thick forest before reaching the open highway, I saw something that made me gasp. Jake must have seen it too because he slowed down. On both sides of the road, the trees were bowing. All of them. Aspen and birch and pine, bending their crowns toward the road as we passed, like mourners at a funeral acknowledging the hearse. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered. "I see it." We drove between the bowing trees for almost a mile. Then, as we reached the edge of the forest, they straightened again. The last tree, a massive white pine that might have been 200 years old, held its bough a moment longer than the rest, its branches dipping low enough to touch the roof of our RV, and then we were through, back in the open country of rolling hills and farmland, and the forest was behind us. Jake's next scan is in 3 weeks. I've been having nightmares about what it might show, not because I think the cancer will be back. The doctors are confident his prognosis is good. No, I'm afraid of what might be inside him that isn't cancer. What might have followed us out of those woods. What might have been woken by his sickness and decided to come home with us. Because sometimes, late at night when Jake is sleeping, I hear him whispering. Not in his own voice, but in many voices. Children's voices. And when I get close enough to hear what they're saying, it's always the same thing. "We're hungry. We're so hungry. Can we stay? Please let us stay." Last week I found a small bone in our bathroom sink. Just a fragment. Nothing I could identify. Jake says I'm imagining things again, that it was probably just a chicken bone from dinner that got caught in the drain. He's probably right. But I saved it anyway, wrapped it in tissue paper and put it in a box in the back of my closet. Because if I'm not imagining it, if there really are children following us, clinging to Jake's brush with death like shipwreck survivors clinging to driftwood, then I want to give them something. Proof that they existed. Proof that someone knows, someone remembers. The white pine in our backyard started growing 3 days ago. I say started growing because there was nothing there before, just an empty patch of lawn. But now there's a sapling, maybe 4 feet tall, growing impossibly fast. Jake says we should cut it down, but I won't let him, because when I stand next to it in the early morning light before Jake wakes up, I can hear it. Not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. It's singing. All those children, singing in voices that have been silent for almost a century, finally allowed to be heard. And sometimes when the wind is right, the tree bows. Just slightly. Just enough. Like it's listening. Story 4. My name is Robert. I'm 34. I came to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State for answers and found echoes that answered back. The RV's engine ticked as it cooled, a rhythmic sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. I'd parked in a dispersed camping area off Forest Road 25, miles from the nearest ranger station, where the Douglas firs grew so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The shadows here were different. Denser, somehow more present than mere absence of light. I'd come here because my brother told me to, because his last letter had been postmarked from Randall, the tiny town at the forest's edge, and because 3 weeks later they'd found his truck abandoned at a trailhead 20 miles from here. The police called it a voluntary disappearance. A man in his late 30s, divorced, no kids, history of depression. The narrative wrote itself. But David wasn't like that. He was methodical, purposeful. If he'd come here, there was a reason, and if he'd left something behind, I'd find it. My dog, Luna, a 6-year-old German shepherd, whined from the passenger seat. She'd been agitated since we'd turned onto the forest road, her ears pinned back, her dark eyes tracking something I couldn't see through the trees. I reached over and scratched behind her ears, feeling the tension in her muscles. "It's okay, girl. Just us and the trees." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The forest felt occupied, watched. I'd been camping since I was a kid. Boy Scouts, family trips, solo excursions through half the national parks in the West, and I'd never felt anything like this. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I climbed out of the RV, and Luna bolted past me, hitting the ground with all four paws and immediately assuming a defensive posture, staring into the tree line. The air smelled wrong. Not bad, exactly, but off. Like ozone before a lightning strike, mixed with something organic and old, like the inside of a cave that hadn't been opened in centuries. "Luna, heel." She obeyed reluctantly, pressing against my leg as I surveyed the campsite. It was a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, with a fire ring someone had built from river stones. The forest pressed in on all sides, the trees so close together that I couldn't see more than 20 or 30 yards in any direction. Dead wood littered the ground, and the underbrush was thick with salal and Oregon grape. I started setting up camp, trying to ignore the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. Luna stayed close, her nose working overtime, occasionally growling low in her throat at nothing I could identify. By the time I had the awning extended and the portable grill set up, the sun was touching the tops of the trees, sending long fingers of shadow across the clearing. That's when I noticed the radio. It was sitting on the picnic table someone had left behind. Weathered wood, half-rotted, probably been there for years. But the radio was new, or at least newish. A small transistor model, red plastic casing, the kind you could pick up at any gas station. It definitely hadn't been there when I'd first scoped out the site 15 minutes ago. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The battery compartment was empty, but when I flicked the power switch, static crackled from the speaker. Loud, angry static that made Luna bark and back away. I turned it off and set it back down, my heart rate picking up. Someone was nearby. Had to be. They'd left the radio as what? A gift? A warning? "Hello," I called out, my voice disappearing into the trees without even an echo. "Anyone there?" Nothing. Just the static silence of the forest, broken now by the first evening bird calls. Except they weren't quite right either. The rhythm was off, the pitch slightly wrong, like someone imitating bird sounds without quite nailing the melody. I grabbed a beer from the RV's fridge and tried to shake off the unease. This was why I'd come. To retrace David's steps, to understand what had drawn him here. In his letter, he'd written about the forest speaking to him, about hearing voices in the static between radio stations, about feeling called. I dismissed it as stress, maybe the start of a breakdown. Now, I wasn't so sure. As the sun set, I built a fire. Luna refused to settle, pacing the perimeter of the campsite with her hackles raised. I'd brought her because she was trained for search and rescue. She'd helped find 3 lost hikers in the Cascades last year, but right now she looked more likely to bolt than to search for anything. The fire wouldn't catch. I tried 3 times, using different kindling, different arrangements of the wood. The matches flared, the paper and twigs caught, flames licked up toward the larger pieces, and then died. Just went out, as if someone had thrown water on them, though the wood remained dry. On the 4th attempt, the fire caught and burned blue. Not the blue-white of a hot fire, but a deep, cold blue like the heart of a gas flame. It gave off light but no heat, and the shadows it cast seemed to move independently of the flames, reaching across the clearing like grasping fingers. "Jesus," I whispered, backing away. Luna was barking now, a continuous aggressive sound I'd never heard from her before. She was staring at something behind me, and when I turned, my blood went cold. A deer stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the ring of blue firelight. An enormous buck, with a rack that had to span 5 feet. But it was the way it stood that froze me. Perfectly still, perfectly upright, with its head cocked at an angle that was almost human, and it was staring directly at me with eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that tableau. Minutes, maybe. Long enough for my legs to cramp, for sweat to start rolling down my back despite the cool evening air. Luna had gone quiet, a whimper building in her throat. Then the deer's mouth opened, not like an animal's mouth, but hinged, mechanical, too wide, and from inside came a sound like static. The same static from the radio, but shaped somehow, pushed into almost words that I felt more than heard. Robert. My name. It said my name. I scrambled backward, nearly tripping over Luna, and grabbed the flashlight from my belt. When I swung the beam toward the deer, it was gone. Just empty forest, the underbrush undisturbed, as if it had never been there at all. The blue fire had returned to normal orange flames, crackling cheerfully. The sudden warmth was almost shocking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the RV with all the doors locked, Luna pressed against my side, both of us staring out the window at the fire I'd let die down to embers. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling the RV. Soft, measured footsteps that stopped every few circuits, as if whoever, whatever, was out there was examining the vehicle, learning its contours. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant through the thick canopy, I found the footprints. They circled the RV in a perfect ring, about 10 feet out. Human footprints, or mostly human. The right size and shape, but the toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and they were pressed deep into the soil as if whatever made them weighed far more than it should. I took photos with my phone. Though the pictures came out grainy and indistinct, the prints seeming to blur and shift in the images. My hands were shaking as I uploaded them to cloud storage, the one bar of service I had flickering in and out. I should have left then, packed up and driven straight back to Seattle, filed a report with the Forest Service, let someone else deal with whatever was happening here. But David's letter burned in my pocket, and I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving would mean never understanding what happened to him. So I stayed. The day passed in a haze of unease. I hiked some of the nearby trails, Luna reluctantly following, both of us jumping at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. The forest felt wrong in the daylight, too. The trees too straight, too evenly spaced, like a theater set rather than natural growth. Several times I found myself on trails I didn't remember taking, leading in directions my compass insisted were impossible. Around noon, I discovered the campsite. It was about a mile from my RV, in a small clearing similar to mine but older, more established. A tent still stood there, modern and well-maintained, the rainfly staked down properly. A cold fire ring. A backpack leaning against a tree, and no one there. "Hello," I called out, Luna pressing against my leg. "Anyone home?" The tent flap was zipped closed from the outside. I approached slowly, my heart hammering, and pulled the zipper down. The tent was open from the inside. Not the door flap, that was zipped shut. But the back wall of the tent had been torn open, the nylon ripped in long, deliberate strokes, as if someone had clawed their way out, or something had clawed its way in. Inside, I found a sleeping bag torn to shreds, a camping stove crushed flat, and a journal. The pages were water-damaged and stained, but I could make out enough of the entries to piece together a story. A solo camper named Marcus. He'd come here 2 months ago. The entries started normal, weather observations, trail notes, wildlife sightings. Then they deteriorated. Complaints about sounds at night, footsteps, voices calling his name. The forest rearranging itself when he wasn't looking. The last entry was dated 6 weeks ago, written in a shaking hand. It found me, wearing my face. Standing outside the tent, I can hear it breathing. It sounds like my mother. She died 5 years ago. The journal ended there. I stuffed it into my jacket and backed away from the campsite, every instinct screaming at me to run. Luna was already ahead of me, pulling on the leash, desperate to leave. We made it halfway back before I realized we were lost. The trail had changed. Not subtly, completely. Where there should have been a fork leading back to my campsite, there was only dense forest. The markers I'd noted on the way, a lightning-struck tree, a boulder shaped like a turtle, were gone, replaced by unfamiliar landmarks. My compass spun lazily, unable to find north. My phone showed no service and the GPS kept loading, the location marker drifting across an unmarked green void on the map. "Okay," I said aloud, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Okay, we just backtrack. Follow our own trail. But when I turned around, our footprints were gone. The trail behind us looked untouched, the pine needles and forest litter undisturbed by our passage. Luna whined and pulled in a direction that felt wrong, her ears flat against her head. I had no better option, so I followed. We walked for what felt like hours but could have been minutes. Time felt slippery here, unreliable. The sun never seemed to move, locked in that same gray afternoon light that made everything look washed out and unreal. Then I heard the voice. Bobby? My childhood nickname. No one had called me that since I was 12, except for David. Bobby, is that you? It was coming from ahead, from somewhere in the thick trees, David's voice unmistakable with that slight rasp from years of smoking. Luna was pulling backward now, her paws digging into the earth, refusing to move forward. I should have listened to her. God, I should have listened. But it was my brother's voice. I pushed forward, leaving the trail, forcing my way through the underbrush. The voice kept calling, always just ahead, always just out of sight. Bobby, I need help. I'm hurt. Please. I broke through a thicket of devil's club and found myself in another clearing, this one smaller, darker, and there, sitting with his back against a tree, was David. He looked wrong. The shape was right. His height, his build, his messy brown hair and wireframe glasses. He was wearing the same jacket I'd seen in the photos the police had shown me, the same hiking boots. But something in the proportions was off, like a photograph that had been stretched slightly in editing. His limbs were too long, his fingers extended just a fraction more than they should, his smile a bit too wide. Bobby, he said, and his voice had an echo to it, a reverb that made my teeth ache. I knew you'd come. Luna was going insane, barking and snarling, lunging against the leash with enough force to nearly pull me off my feet. I held firm, staring at the thing that looked like my brother. You're not David, I said. Its smile widened further, the corners of its mouth reaching nearly to its ears now, revealing too many teeth. No, it agreed, and now the voice was layered. David's voice, and beneath it something else, something that sounded like wind through empty buildings. But he was here. He heard us. He listened. And then he joined us. Where is he? What did you do to him? The thing that wasn't David stood up, and I realized it was at least a foot taller than my brother had been, its proportions continuing to shift and stretch like taffy being pulled. He's here, it said, gesturing at the forest around us. He's in the trees and the soil and the water. He's in the voice that calls you. He's everywhere and nowhere. He's home. I ran. Pure, mindless terror sent me crashing back through the underbrush, Luna racing ahead of me, both of us desperate to put distance between ourselves and that thing. Behind me, I could hear it laughing, a sound like breaking glass, like a child's giggle played backward, like static shaped into mirth. And then I heard it following. Not running. It didn't need to run. It was just there, always at the same distance behind me, its footsteps impossibly loud and perfectly timed with my heartbeat. I could hear it breathing, could hear it still speaking in David's voice, saying things I couldn't quite make out over the pounding of blood in my ears. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together, the ground rising and falling in ways that defied the flat terrain I'd mapped out earlier. Several times I was certain I'd run in a complete circle, recognizing the same landmarks, a rotted stump, a cluster of mushrooms, but each time they were slightly different, slightly wrong, as if the forest was remaking itself with each passing. Finally, gasping and dizzy, I broke through the trees and found my RV, but it wasn't where I'd left it. The clearing was different, bigger, the trees arranged in a too-perfect circle around the campsite. The RV sat at an angle I hadn't parked it, the door hanging open, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Luna refused to get closer, planting herself at the tree line and whimpering. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. It was getting dark fast, faster than it should, the sun seeming to plummet toward the horizon like a stone dropping into water. The inside of the RV had been ransacked. Not destroyed, arranged. My belongings had been moved, organized into patterns I didn't understand. my clothes laid out in a spiral on the floor, my food arranged by color on the counter, my sleeping bag torn into strips and braided into a rope that hung from the ceiling light. And on the table, written in what looked like ash, "Tomorrow." The radio crackled to life. I spun, my flashlight beam finding it still sitting where I'd left it on the picnic table outside. But now it was on, the power switch in the on position despite the missing batteries. Static poured from it, but underneath the white noise I could hear something else. A voice, many voices, layered and overlapping, all speaking in unison. "Robert, Robert, Robert." And then, "Tomorrow you'll understand. Tomorrow you'll join. Tomorrow you'll be home." I grabbed Luna and locked us both in the RV, my hands shaking so badly I nearly couldn't turn the key. The radio kept broadcasting from outside, the voices growing louder, more insistent, until they weren't just saying my name but reciting my life, my birthday, my mother's maiden name, my first pet's name, my childhood address, my college GPA, the name of the girl I'd lost my virginity to, on, an endless litany of my existence broadcast to the dark forest. Then the radio went silent. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise. I sat in the driver's seat, Luna pressed against me, both of us staring out the windshield at the clearing that was now completely dark. The moon hadn't risen. The stars were wrong. Wrong constellations, wrong positions, wrong colors bleeding red at the edges. Something moved at the tree line. Not the David thing. Something else. Multiple somethings, their forms indistinct in the darkness, but I could see their eyes. Dozens of eyes. Hundreds maybe, reflecting no light but glowing with their own dim luminescence. They were arranged in pairs, at different heights, suggesting different sizes and shapes of things standing just beyond the clearing's edge. Watching. Waiting. I tried to start the RV. The engine turned over, coughed, died. I tried again. Again. Each time, the engine would catch for a moment before failing, as if something was choking off the fuel line, strangling the ignition. Luna started barking at the windshield, and I saw why. One of the things had moved closer. It stood at the edge of the blue firelight. The campfire had reignited itself, burning with those cold flames again, and I could see it more clearly now. It had David's face. Not wearing it like a mask, but grafted onto something that was fundamentally not human. The body was wrong. Too many joints in the arms and legs, the torso elongated and twisted, the spine curved in ways that would break a human. But the face was perfect. Identical down to the small scar on his left cheek from a childhood fall. It smiled at me, David's smile, and mouthed a single word, "Tomorrow." Others were emerging now, stepping into the firelight. More faces I recognized. From photos in Marcus's journal, from missing person posters I'd seen online while researching the area, from news articles about vanished hikers. Dozens of them, all grafted onto those impossible bodies, all wearing expressions of contentment or bliss or something that might have been both. They began to circle the RV, moving in perfect synchronization, their footsteps falling in rhythm. Around and around, never breaking pace, never looking away from the windows. The sound of their feet on the earth was hypnotic, steady as a heartbeat, and I felt myself starting to drift, to lose focus. Luna's frantic barking snapped me back. She was at the rear window now, and when I looked I understood why. The forest was moving. The trees were pulling closer, their roots sliding through the soil with a sound like tearing paper. With each circuit the things made around the RV, the clearing shrank. 10 feet closer. 20. The trees were going to crush us, slowly, inevitably, squeezing the space until there was nowhere left to be but among them, among the things that wore human faces. I tried the ignition again, pumping the gas pedal, begging under my breath. This time, miraculously, it caught. The engine roared to life, headlights blazing across the clearing, and for just a moment I saw them clearly. All of them, dozens of amalgamated horrors with human faces and impossible bodies, their eyes reflecting the light like a crowd of animals caught on a night road. I threw the RV into gear and gunned it. The things scattered, but the trees were still there, still closing in. I aimed for the widest gap, the RV bouncing over the rough ground, branches scraping against the sides with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. One of the things threw itself at the windshield. A woman's face I didn't recognize, mouth open in a silent scream, and I swerved, clipping a tree trunk hard enough to crack the passenger side mirror. Luna was thrown against the dash, yelping. I grabbed her collar with one hand, keeping the other on the wheel, steering more by instinct than sight as I crashed through the undergrowth. The trees were pressing in from both sides now, the gap narrowing, and I could see through the rearview mirror that they were closing behind us, sealing the way we'd come. The RV scraped between two massive trunks, paint peeling away in long strips, and then we were through, bouncing onto what I hoped was the forest road. I didn't slow down to check. I just drove, following the barely visible track, ignoring the GPS that still showed us nowhere, trusting that any direction was better than back. The forest fought us the whole way. Trees fell across the road behind us. I saw them in the mirror, crashing down seconds after we passed. Boulders rolled out of nowhere, forcing me to swerve. The road itself seemed to shift and change, forking in directions I didn't remember, but I just kept choosing, kept moving, kept the accelerator pressed to the floor. Luna was whimpering, bleeding from a cut on her ear, but alive. Alive. We were still alive. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I saw lights ahead. Real lights, electric and steady. The paved road, civilization. I burst out of the forest like a cork from a bottle, the RV fishtailing as it hit the pavement, and I could have sobbed with relief. The main road stretched ahead, empty in both directions, and I turned toward Randall, toward people and police stations and rational explanations that I knew wouldn't come. In the rearview mirror, the forest road was gone, just solid tree line, as if there had never been an opening at all. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached Randall's single gas station at dawn. The attendant, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, took one look at the RV, gouged and scratched, the passenger mirror hanging by wires, pine needles embedded in every crevice, and whistled. "Rough night?" I just nodded, paying for gas in cash because my hands were shaking too badly to manage my card. "You were up in the Pinchot?" he asked, making conversation. "Yeah. Camping season's tough up there. Lost a lot of folks over the years." He said it casually, like he was talking about the weather. "Forest Service doesn't like to admit it, but people go in and don't come out. Been that way since I was a kid." "You ever heard of anyone coming back?" I asked. "Changed?" He looked at me for a long moment, his youthful face suddenly seeming older, more knowing. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Sometimes folks come back. But they're not folks anymore, if you know what I mean. They look right mostly, but something's off. They move wrong, talk wrong, and they always want to go back, always trying to convince others to go with them." My blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "My brother went up there 10 years ago," the kid said. "Came back 3 days later. Looked just like him. Sounded like him. But my mom knew. Don't ask me how, but she knew. She made him leave, told him he wasn't welcome. He went back to the forest. We never saw him again." He handed me my change. "You get someone out?" "No," I whispered. "No, I didn't." "Then you're lucky. Most people who go looking don't come back at all." I drove back to Seattle on autopilot, Luna sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was high and bright, the city loud and normal and blessedly mundane. I carried Luna inside, tended to her wounds, and then locked every door and window. The police were polite but clearly skeptical when I filed my report. Missing brother, strange occurrences, possible cult activity in the Gifford Pinchot. They took my statement, took my photos, which showed nothing but blurry images and normal forest, and promised to send a unit to check it out. 3 days later, they called me back. They'd found the dispersed camping area I'd described. The coordinates I'd given them were accurate, but there was no evidence anyone had been there in months. No tire tracks, no disturbed earth, no footprints. Just virgin forest, untouched and pristine. They did find something interesting, though. About a quarter-mile from where I'd claimed to camp, they found remains. Scattered bones, picked clean, arranged in a spiral pattern. Dental records eventually identified them as David. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 3 months. That was 6 weeks ago. I haven't slept properly since. Every night I hear the radio static in my walls, shaped into voices, shaped into my name. Luna won't leave my side, and sometimes she stares at the door and growls at nothing I can see. Yesterday, I got a letter. No return address. Postmarked from Randall. Inside was a single photograph of the forest clearing where I'd camped. The RV was in the shot, right where I'd parked it, and standing beside it, smiling at the camera, was me. I don't remember anyone taking that photo. I was alone out there, except for Luna. And the thing is, I can see myself in the RV's window too, behind the wheel, staring out. 2 of me, one inside, one outside. On the back of the photo, written in handwriting I recognized as my own. Tomorrow. I've been researching, trying to understand what happened to David, what's happening to me. The Gifford Pinchot has a history. Indigenous peoples avoided certain areas, called them thresholds, where the world became thin. Loggers in the early 1900s reported entire crews vanishing. Hikers in the 70s and 80s described similar experiences to mine. The changing forest, the voices, the faces. There's a pattern. People go in, looking for someone or something. The forest offers them what they seek, but twisted, corrupted. And if they're lucky enough to leave, they bring something back with them. Something that wears their shape, learns their life, waits for the right moment to replace them. I keep checking myself in the mirror, looking for signs that I'm not me anymore. My proportions seem right. My voice sounds normal. My memories are intact. But every day I feel a little more pulled, a little more drawn back toward those trees. Luna knows. She watches me constantly now, with an expression that might be fear or might be pity. Last night I woke up standing at my apartment door, my hand on the knob, ready to turn it. I have no memory of getting out of bed, of walking across the room, and in the moment before I fully woke, I was so happy. The forest was calling, and I needed to answer. The radio voices are getting louder. They don't just say my name anymore. They say, "Come home." And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake and terrified and checking the locks compulsively, is that it's starting to make sense. The forest isn't a place. It's a state of being, a frequency you can tune into. David found it. Marcus found it. All those missing people found it. And they're still there, still broadcasting, still calling for others to join them in that space between the trees where time doesn't work right, and you can be remade into something that doesn't have to hurt, or worry, or grieve. Tomorrow keeps coming. Every morning is tomorrow. Every moment is the tomorrow the voices promised. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I called my mother yesterday, just to hear her voice. She asked if I was okay, said I sounded different. I told her I was fine, just tired from the camping trip. She said David had sounded tired too, the last time they'd spoken. She told me not to go back to the forest. She said she couldn't lose another son. I promised her I wouldn't. But even as I said it, I was looking at the map on my wall, at the route back to Gifford Pinchot that I'd marked in red pen. The route that's gotten deeper, darker, like I've been tracing it over and over without realizing. Luna is packed. The RV is fueled. All my accounts are in order. Tomorrow, I'm going back. Not because I want to, but because I'm starting to understand that I never really left. Part of me is still there, sitting in that clearing, listening to the voices in the radio static. And that part is calling the rest of me home. David was right. The forest speaks. And once you learn its language, once you hear your name in its voice, you can't ever really unhear it. I'm writing this down as a warning, as evidence, as a last desperate attempt to hold on to who I was before the trees knew my name. I'm uploading it to every platform I can think of, setting it to post automatically if I don't check in within a week. If you're reading this, I didn't come back. Or worse, I did come back, but I wasn't alone. And the thing that's wearing my face is looking for you now, calling your name in my voice, inviting you to come find what the forest has to teach. The radio on my kitchen counter just turned on by itself. No batteries, no power cord. It's playing static. And underneath the static, shaped like words, shaped like promises, I can hear them all. David and Marcus and all the others singing in harmony, welcoming me home. Tomorrow isn't a day, it's a threshold, and I'm standing right on its edge. Story 5. I'm Olivia, 32 years old. The ridge above Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas was shaped like teeth, and I was inside the mouth. We'd driven 12 hours from Kansas City in Marcus's parents' old Winnebago, the kind with faded blue stripes and a toilet that barely flushed. Marcus sat beside me now, stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon, his reading glasses catching the early morning light filtering through the RV's small windows. My best friend Jenna sprawled across the dinette booth behind us, her dark hair still matted from sleep, scrolling through her phone with increasing frustration. "Still no signal," she muttered. "That's kind of the point," Marcus said without looking up from his coffee. He had that patient tone he used when explaining things to his students. High school chemistry teacher patience. It grated on me sometimes, though I'd never tell him that. "The point is to be completely cut off from civilization?" Jenna asked. "Because mission accomplished." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the Arkansas wilderness spread below us. We'd parked in a clearing the ranger had recommended, away from the main campground. Private, he'd said. Quiet. The ridge rose behind us in a jagged line of limestone and cedar, and something about its silhouette made my stomach tighten. The rock formations jutted at angles that seemed wrong, like teeth in a jaw that had been broken and healed crooked. "It's beautiful," I said, trying to convince myself. Marcus smiled and squeezed my hand. 3 days of hiking, no work emails, actual conversation. It'll be good for us. He was right about that last part. We'd been talking past each other for months, our relationship compressed into the margins between his lesson plans and my paralegal work, between grocery runs and Netflix binges. This trip was supposed to fix something. I just wasn't sure what. Jenna had invited herself along 2 weeks ago, showing up at our apartment with a bottle of wine and red-rimmed eyes. Her boyfriend had left her for someone younger, someone without student loan debt and a chronic anxiety disorder. I couldn't tell her no. Marcus had been less enthusiastic, but he'd agreed with the same patient smile he wore now. The morning stretched warm and humid as we prepared for our first hike. Marcus checked our supplies with methodical precision. Water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, compass, map. The map troubled me immediately. The paper was old, the ink faded in places, and several trails seemed to overlap in ways that made no geometric sense. "When did you get this?" I asked. "Downloaded it from the park website," Marcus said. "Printed it last week, but when I looked at it again, the trails had shifted. Or maybe I'd been looking at it wrong. The ridge we were camped beneath was marked with a small symbol I couldn't decipher, something between a star and a warning sign. "Let's take the Butterfield Trail," Jenna said, pointing at the map. Her finger landed on a loop that would take us through the forest and along the ridge. 4 hours, round trip, moderate difficulty. We set out at 9, the July heat already pressing through the tree canopy. The trail started level, winding through oak and hickory, the ground soft with decades of fallen leaves. Birdsong filled the air, but something about it felt off. The notes didn't quite connect into melody. They stopped and started in fragmented bursts, like a conversation interrupted. Marcus walked ahead, his hiking boots crunching with steady rhythm. Jenna fell into step beside me, her breathing already labored. She wasn't in shape for this, but she'd insisted on coming. "You think this was a mistake?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean? Me being here? Third wheel and all that?" I squeezed her arm. "You're not a third wheel, and you're my best friend. I want you here." That was mostly true. The truth had layers, like the limestone strata visible in the ridge walls we passed. Yes, I wanted her here, but I also wanted time alone with Marcus. Wanted to remember why I'd fallen in love with him 5 years ago, before the routine calcified around us like sediment. An hour into the hike, we found the first tent. It stood just off the trail, partially hidden by a cluster of cedar trees. A dome tent, blue and gray, identical to the one we'd brought. I mean, identical. Same brand, same color scheme, same small tier near the bottom zipper. "Someone else camping up here," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its certainty. We approached slowly. The tent was zipped shut from the outside. Through the mesh window I could see sleeping bags inside. 2 of them. They looked occupied, shapes bulging beneath the fabric in a way that suggested bodies. "Hello," Marcus called. No response. "Maybe they're on a hike," Jenna said, but she'd taken a step back. I moved closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The tent smelled wrong. Not like body odor or food, more like something chemical, medicinal, like the antiseptic smell of a hospital corridor. "Olivia, don't," Marcus said. But I'd already crouched down, reaching for the zipper. My fingers touched the metal pull and recoiled. It was warm. Fever warm. The whole tent radiated heat, despite being in shade. The shapes inside the sleeping bag shifted. I jerked backward, falling onto my tailbone. The shapes moved again, rolling over in perfect synchronization. Then one of them sat up. The sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. "We need to go," I said, scrambling to my feet. The figure inside the tent turned its head toward us. I couldn't see its face through the mesh, just a silhouette, but I felt its attention like a physical weight. Then a hand emerged from the sleeping bag. It pressed against the mesh from inside, fingers spreading wide. That hand wore the same copper bracelet I was wearing, the one Marcus had given me for our anniversary. We ran. I don't know who started running first. Maybe all 3 of us moved at once. Some primal synchronization overriding thought. The trail blurred beneath my feet, branches whipping at my face. Behind us I heard the sound of a zipper. Long and slow, teeth separating one by one. We didn't stop until the trail forked, a full mile away. Marcus bent over, hands on his knees, gulping air. Jenna had gone pale, sweat streaming down her face. "What the fuck was that?" she gasped. "I don't know," I said, but that was a lie. I knew what I'd seen. That bracelet. That exact bracelet. The clasp had a small dent where I'd dropped it in a parking lot 3 months ago. Marcus pulled out the map with shaking hands. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at the trail markers. "This isn't right." "What do you mean?" "We should be heading east. The ridge should be on our left." "But it's on our right now." I looked up at the limestone formations towering above us. He was correct. The ridge had switched sides, or we had, or the trail had bent in ways that made no sense. "We just got turned around," Jenna said, but her voice cracked. "We were running. We just need to backtrack." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We're not going back that way." We chose the right fork instead, following a trail that should have looped us back toward the campground. The sun climbed higher, but the temperature dropped. I wrapped my arms around myself, watching my breath mist in the air. In July, in Arkansas. The birdsong had stopped completely. "Listen," Jenna whispered. We stood in silence. Not peaceful silence. Oppressive silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums until they ache. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of our breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. Then, from somewhere ahead on the trail, we heard a voice. Olivia, my name, clear as crystal, spoken in Marcus's voice. But Marcus stood right beside me, his mouth closed, his face drained of color. "Olivia," the voice called again. "Where are you?" It came from around the next bend, where the trail disappeared into a thick grove of cedars. The trees grew so close together their branches interlocked, creating a tunnel of shadow. "We're going back," Marcus said. "Right now. Forget the trail." We cut through the woods, but when we turned around, the trail behind us had changed. The fork we'd come from had vanished. In its place, a solid wall of limestone rose 15 feet high, streaked with something dark and wet. "That wasn't there," Jenna said. "That wasn't fucking there. Olivia, I'm worried about you." Marcus's voice again, but not from Marcus. from the cedar tunnel. "Come here, let me see you." I grabbed Marcus's hand. It was ice cold. "Don't respond," I whispered. "Don't say anything." We moved parallel to the trail, pushing through underbrush, branches catching at our clothes. The forest had grown denser, trees crowding closer together. I could hear Jenna sobbing behind me, trying to muffle the sound with her hand. The voice followed us. "Olivia, you're scaring me. Where are you going? Olivia, Olivia, Olivia." It repeated my name like a chant, each repetition coming faster, the tone shifting from concern to something else, something hungry. We stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a structure, a lean-to shelter made from branches and moss. Old. The wood was gray and rotted, but the construction was deliberate. Someone had built this with care. Inside the shelter, arranged in a perfect circle, were 6 backpacks. Marcus approached them slowly. He opened the first one. Inside were clothes, a water bottle, a wallet. He pulled out the driver's license and went rigid. "This is my wallet," he said. "This is my license." I opened another pack. My paralegal ID badge stared up at me from inside a side pocket. My handwriting on a shopping list. My chapstick, the one I'd lost 2 months ago. Jenna's pack was there too, and 3 others we didn't recognize. "This is wrong," Marcus said. "This is all wrong. We need to get out of here. We need to get back to the RV." But which direction was the RV? The ridge surrounded us now, visible through the trees in every direction. We were in a bowl, a depression in the landscape, or a mouth. The thought came unbidden. We're in a mouth. Jenna had stopped crying. She stared at the backpacks with an expression I couldn't read. "We're not leaving," she said quietly. "What? We can't leave, don't you see?" She pointed at the ridge. "It's already got us." "Jenna, you're in shock," I said. "We're going to figure this out. We just need to stay calm and—" "There were 2 people in that tent," she interrupted. 2 sleeping bags. 2 shapes. You saw them. They were us, Olivia. They were you and Marcus." "That's impossible." "Then explain the bracelet. Explain the backpacks. Explain why the trail is eating itself." Marcus grabbed her shoulders. "Listen to me. Panic doesn't help. We're going to pick a direction and walk until we find the campground or a ranger station or another human being. Okay?" She nodded slowly, but I saw the resignation in her eyes. She didn't believe we'd find anything. We chose north by Marcus's compass, though the needle spun lazily, unable to settle on a direction. The forest grew darker as we walked, despite the sun still being high. The canopy had thickened, or maybe the light itself had changed quality. Everything looked washed out, colors leached to gray and brown. I kept my eyes on Marcus's back, focusing on the rhythm of his steps, 1 foot in front of the other. That was all we had to do. Keep moving, don't stop. Don't think about the tent or the voice or the impossible geography. Jenna screamed. I spun around. She stood frozen, pointing at something ahead. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadow. Then the shadow moved. A figure stood between 2 oaks, perfectly still. It had the approximate shape of a person, head, torso, limbs, but the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too long, the head tilted at an angle that should have broken the neck. It wore clothes, or something like clothes, dark and tattered. Then it smiled. I know that sounds impossible to see a smile from 50 feet away in shadow, but I saw it, felt it, a wide white crescent splitting the darkness where a face should be. "Don't run," Marcus whispered. "Back away slowly." We took 3 steps backward before the figure moved. It didn't walk. It folded. Segments of it bent at joints that shouldn't exist, and suddenly it was 10 feet closer, then 20, still smiling. We ran again. This time, Jenna fell. I heard her cry out behind me, heard the impact of her body hitting the ground. Marcus and I stopped, turned back. The figure stood over her, its impossible smile now close enough to see clearly. Not teeth. Gaps. The smile was made of absences, spaces where something had been removed from reality. Marcus threw a rock. It passed through the figure like it was smoke, and that's when I understood. This thing wasn't solid. It was a hole shaped like a person, a three-dimensional gap in the world. Jenna screamed again as the figure bent down, its two long arms reaching for her. I ran back, grabbed her hand, pulled. Marcus grabbed her other arm. Together we hauled her up and ran, the figure following behind us with its stuttering, folding movement. We burst through a line of cedars and found ourselves at the edge of a cliff. Below us, maybe 30 feet down, was our campground. I could see the Winnebago, still parked where we'd left it. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. There. Marcus pointed at a narrow trail zigzagging down the cliff face. Steep, but manageable. Behind us, branches cracked. The figure was close. We descended in a barely controlled fall, half sliding down loose rock and dirt. My hands scraped raw on stone. Jenna sobbed the whole way down, a constant keening sound that made my chest ache. When we reached the bottom, I expected to feel safe. We were back. We'd made it. But something was wrong with the campground. The Winnebago sat exactly where we'd left it, but now there was a second RV beside it. Identical model. Same faded blue stripes. Same license plate. No, Marcus breathed. We approached slowly. Through the window of the first RV, our RV, I could see movement. Someone was inside. Two someones. Marcus climbed the steps and opened the door. I sat inside, stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon. Beside me, Marcus read a book, his glasses catching the light. The scene was identical to this morning, down to the angle of his head and the position of my hand on the spoon. The other me looked up and met my eyes. She smiled. Then, in perfect synchronization with Marcus beside me, the other Marcus smiled too. They stood and walked toward the door. We backed away, but they kept coming, stepping down from the RV with movements that mirrored our own backing away. When I raised my hand, other me raised her hand. When Marcus stumbled, other Marcus stumbled. "They're puppeting us," Jenna whispered. "They're learning how to be us." The doubles stopped 5 feet away. Up close I could see the small differences. Other me's eyes were slightly too wide, her smile slightly too fixed. Other Marcus's breathing didn't quite match his movements. "What do you want?" I asked. Other me opened her mouth. At first, nothing came out. Then, in a voice that started as mine but deepened into something else, something ancient and vast. "To wear you." The doubles lunged. I don't remember clearly what happened next. My mind has blurred the details, maybe as protection. I remember Marcus shouting. I remember Jenna swinging a branch she'd grabbed from somewhere. I remember other me's hands around my throat and how they felt both solid and insubstantial at once, like she was reaching through me to grip something deeper than flesh. Marcus pulled her off me. She fell backward, and where she hit the ground, the earth opened. Just a crack at first, then widening into a fissure that glowed with something that wasn't light. Other Marcus tried to grab the edges, but the ground crumbled under his fingers. Both doubles slid into that crack, and I heard them screaming. Not with fear, with rage. The fissure sealed itself, leaving only disturbed dirt. We stood in silence, breathing hard. Then Jenna pointed at the second RV. "We have to look inside," she said. "No," Marcus said immediately. "We get in our RV and we drive away, right now." "What if there are more of them?" Jenna asked. "What if we leave and they follow us? We need to know." She was right. I knew she was right, but every cell in my body screamed at me to run. I climbed the steps of the second RV and opened the door. Inside, sitting at the dinette, was Jenna. She looked up at me with hollow eyes. Her wrists were bound with rope. Behind her stood another figure, the folding thing from the forest, but now it wore a ranger's uniform. Its smile had widened into something that took up most of its face. "Help me," Jenna inside the RV mouthed silently. I looked back at Jenna standing beside Marcus. She smiled at me. "It's okay," she said. "You don't need to help her. She's old. We're new." The thing wearing Jenna's shape reached for me. I slammed the door and ran to our RV. Marcus was already in the driver's seat, key in the ignition. I dove inside and he gunned the engine. Through the window I watched fake Jenna standing in the clearing waving goodbye with that too-wide smile. The RV lurched forward, bouncing over rough ground. Marcus drove without looking at the map, without following any road, just pointing us away from the ridge and flooring it. Branches scraped the sides. Something hit the windshield with a crack that spread across the glass in a spiderweb pattern. We drove for hours. The sun set, then rose, then set again. The landscape never changed. Just trees and more trees and that god-awful ridge always visible in the distance, its tooth-like formations pointing at the sky. "We're in a loop," Marcus said finally. His voice was hoarse. "We can't get out." "We have to get out," I said. "We have to." But I was starting to understand. The ridge wasn't a geographic feature. It was the boundary of something. We'd driven past it when we arrived, driven straight into the mouth, and now we were being digested. Slowly. Thoroughly. The real Jenna was probably still in that second RV. Or maybe she'd been consumed already, her shape stolen and worn by something that wanted to understand what it meant to be human. Marcus pulled over. We sat in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry I brought us here." I took his hand. "It's not your fault, but maybe it was. Maybe we'd been so focused on fixing our relationship that we'd driven straight into a trap designed for people like us. People trying to recapture something already lost." Through the window, I saw the first tent again, right where we'd found it that morning, or what we thought was morning. How long had we actually been here? Time moved strangely in the mouth. The tent's zipper was opening. Something crawled out. It looked like me, but its movements were more fluid now, more practiced. It had learned. Behind it came another shape. Marcus, but better. Handsomer, more confident. They'd taken what they needed from us and refined it. More figures emerged from the forest. Doubles of people I didn't recognize. A family of 4. A young couple. A solo hiker. All wearing stolen shapes, all moving with that same uncanny fluidity. They surrounded the RV. Marcus started the engine again, but the RV wouldn't move. I looked down and saw why. The tires had sunk into the earth. Not mud, the ground itself had grown soft, accepting us into it like quicksand. The doubles pressed their faces against the windows. My own face stared back at me, analyzing, memorizing every detail of my fear. "Marcus," I whispered, "I love you. I love you too." The windows began to crack under the pressure of all those hands. That was 3 days ago, or 3 weeks, or 3 hours. Time doesn't mean much here anymore. We're still in the RV. We haven't left. Can't leave. The doubles visit sometimes, pressing their faces against the glass to watch us. Sometimes they mimic our movements. Sometimes they just smile. Marcus doesn't talk much anymore. He sits at the dinette, staring at the map as the trails rearrange themselves into patterns that might be language or might be nothing. He's losing weight. So am I. We ran out of food yesterday, but I'm not hungry. The hunger went away when I stopped fighting. Sometimes I see the real Jenna through the window. She's walking through the campground, checking on us. She's been replaced, but some part of her remains, trapped in this place like we are. She waves sometimes. I don't wave back. Last night I opened the door. Just a crack. Just to see what would happen. The doubles were waiting. They didn't force their way in. They just stood there, patient as stone, wearing the faces of everyone who'd ever driven up that road and parked beneath the ridge. One of them looked exactly like me, down to the scar on my left knee and the chipped tooth I got in 4th grade. She smiled and offered me her hand. "You can stop fighting," she said in my voice. "It doesn't hurt to be worn." I almost took her hand. Almost. Instead, I closed the door and locked it. But the lock doesn't matter. I understand that now. The lock is just a theater, a performance of resistance. The ridge has us. Has had us since the moment we drove past those limestone teeth. Marcus is sleeping now, or pretending to sleep. His breathing has changed over the past few days. It's too regular, too measured, like he's learning to breathe the way a human should breathe, rather than actually breathing. I think he was replaced yesterday, or maybe 3 days ago. It's hard to tell. The thing wearing his shape opens its eyes and smiles at me. "Olivia," it says, "come here." And I do. Because what choice do I have? The ridge above Devil's Den State Park is shaped like teeth, and I'm learning what it means to be swallowed. Sometimes at night I hear Jenna screaming from the other RV. Sometimes it's my own voice doing the screaming. Sometimes I can't tell the difference. The map on the table has changed again. Now it shows only one destination, marked with that symbol I couldn't decipher. It's clearer now. It's a mouth. We're already inside it, and it's still hungry.